Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes and democratic transitions. Join us as we hear from prominent figures who have played pivotal roles as diplomats, negotiators, lawyers, civil society actors in the quest for a durable peace. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. This is the second episode in our special mini-series in which we focus on Syria, a nation that has been at the center of global headlines in the recent months. Today, I am honored to welcome my good friend for over 15 years, Ammar Abdulhamid. Ammar is a Syrian intellectual and activist who has spent the last 2 decades advocating for democratic reform and a peaceful Syria. As a prominent human rights and pro-democracy activist, author, and political analyst, Ammar has played a pivotal role in shaping international understanding of Syria. He has briefed U.S. presidents, provided congressional testimony, and advised governments on the complexities of Syrian politics and society. Ammar is a respected voice on Middle Eastern affairs and offers nuanced perspectives on the challenges facing the region. Ammar, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Same here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, Ammar, let's jump right into the conversation. It's been a little bit over a month now since the overthrow of the Assad regime. Just give us a contextual analysis of your understanding of the sentiment in Syria right now. What are people feeling, thinking, hoping for in Syria?
That's a very complicated question, actually, because it all depends on who you are. If you're a pro-regime person, or if you were at least in this gray zone where you prefer the regime to the opposition because you had a negative view of the opposition, or you're just generally afraid of change, you are now worried. I mean, you're worried over your future. You're worried how the rebels are going to treat you on the long run. It is true that the first days, the first few weeks, 50 days, in fact, right now, passed without any major incidents. There have been some sporadic acts of violence and revenge seeking on parts of not necessarily the rebels themselves, but affiliated groups and also the people in different communities taking revenge against the local informants or a local war criminal that they knew was in charge of a prison or a security apparatus. There have been incidents like this, but no major acts of violence, no massacres, no sort of prolonged confrontations where civilians were caught in between and had to suffer. So in this regard, if you're a pro-regime person, you have reasons to be worried, but at the same time, to see in the conditions an opportunity to engage the rebels, which is what the leaders of the local Alawite and Christian and Druze communities are busy doing. They're busy sending signals. They're sitting down with the representative of the rebels, talking about their concerns, and they're trying to appease their communities. So there are activities on these issues, worry mixed with optimism and extent. If you're an anti-regime person, regardless of whether you're secular or Islamic leaning, you are happy. You're enthused. You might be worried about the services because they are in terrible shape. The electricity, we only have 2 or 3 hours of electricity per day. The water services are not the best. There are a lot of reasons to be concerned about these issues, but generally speaking, now you have hope. Under Assad, you had no hope, no everything, all possibilities were dreary and dark. But now you have a chance to be optimistic. You have a chance to participate. People are not waiting, they're volunteering, they're going in the street, they're cleaning the street, they're removing trash, they're regulating traffic, they're trying to do their civic duties. Now they are allowed to. Doing your civic duty in that sense was a reason for imprisonment after the Assad regime. No local initiatives were allowed. Now you can have local initiatives. So people in this regard are optimistic. Now, if you're a secular person, you might be worried that you are now under the control of the Islamist group. And they have a record in the Idlib province where they were based for many years of being very strict in their interpretation of Islam. But they haven't tried to do anything to impose an Islamic agenda on anyone. They are saying, look, We know this country, the Damascus and Aleppo and the areas right now under our control, the major cities are very different from that local community that we are in charge of. And we understand that we have to use a different mindset right now and be open to difference. So they are saying all the right things, and at the same time, there have not been any major incidents. There have been some incidents of basically someone goes into a bar and say you cannot drink or you cannot mix, but that was an individual act, and they get immediately reported to the rebels and they're stopped. So for now, the Christmas celebrations went according to plans. The New Year's Eve, absolutely no problem, and the rebels provided security for everyone, even for the most libertine, shows of enthusiasm and celebratory moods. So in this regard, they have been managing the situation well. People are optimistic. They are also concerned. They're waiting to see if there is an official arrangement of sort that needs to be emerged, that needs to emerge soon. You cannot just be on vague promises and this general unofficial climate of freedom. But for now, they're enjoying it. They're enjoying the moment, but there's still a lot of expectations for the days and weeks and months ahead.
Well, Ammar, let's pick up on that and dive in a little bit deeper. You've touched on two things: the societal challenges, given the very eclectic nature of Syria, be it ethnic identity, religion, class, culture. It's a highly eclectic place. And then also the political challenges. There's an interim government. It's essentially the HTS. There's conversations and plans for national dialogue, a constitution. I noticed recently on LinkedIn you posted that the foreign minister, the first time ever, had gone to the Davos and didn't say anything apparently. But what are some of the societal challenges? And then separately, or maybe they're related, what are some of the political challenges that Syria is facing? And how do you assess Syria navigating those societal and those political challenges?
The societal challenges, in a sense, is about the religious and diversity, the regional diversity, and the political views, diversity of political views. We are a country that, for a long time, had led the way in terms of the socialist movement in the Middle East and the communist movement in the Middle East. So we have a lot of secular intellectuals. We also had liberals. For a long time, we had liberal intellectuals. There are few that didn't really sort of influence the discourse as much as the left, but they did exist. And we also led the way in this. And Syria is sort of renowned in the Arab world and Middle Eastern society in general for being an intellectual hub and an artistic hub. Syrian artists are all over the place. They're famous all over the Arab world and celebrated. So when you have the writers, the authors, the philosophers, the sociologists, the thinkers, all of them basically in the region have a secular mindset and are from Syria for the most part. So you have a legacy to contend with here. You cannot just ignore it and say we're going to put this aside and now we're going to have only an Islamic reference. So if they want to maintain Syria's credibility and their own credibility in the eyes of the Arab world, then these things that made Syria renowned and acceptable and celebrated in the region have to be kept alive and have to flourish even more. So that means they really need to show greater amount of deference and tolerance and acceptability and accommodation to the artistic and intellectual community in Syria. The religious diversity in the country is amazing. It's not just Christians and Muslims, it's a variety of Christians. We have anything from Jehovah's Witnesses, oh, there are few, only a handful, but Catholics and Orthodox and Protestants in a variety of shades and colors. We have even the Catholic movement, you have the Assyrian Catholics, and you have the Greek Catholics, and you have it's in Latins, and so it's a diversity of movements all over the place, and all of them want to be accommodated somehow. So it's not an issue of dealing simply with the large title, a Christian, a Druze, an Alawite, or whatever. There are a lot of internal differences as well that need to be accommodated. All of this influences culture. And so when you hear someone from HTS saying, well, 90% are Muslims, so the issue of Sharia is definitely need to be considered. One, you wonder about where did he come from exactly? I mean, what Syria did he live in that he can come up with this conclusion? The reality is we also have a large Kurdish, 10, 15% almost of the Syrian people are Kurds, and they are very secular. I mean, Kurds have a lot of reason historically to be secular. And so that's 15% of the population. You have Druze for their own reasons also prefer secular rule, even though they might be socially conservative. The Christians also the same way, the Alawites the same way, and a large percent of the Sunni community in Syria that the HTS rebels, think they can represent, actually secular-minded. So there is a strong secular current. It may not be unified, but it is there, and they have to contend with that. They have to find a way to accommodate that. Otherwise, they will just be rebranding themselves in the same way that Hafiz al-Assad rebranded his movement. We had a transitional period under Hafiz al-Assad in 1970 in which he led the country and he promised to basically stabilize the situation after a chaotic period in the 60s. And he ended up introducing a socialist authoritarian regime, sectarian in nature, under the guise of secular rule. Now we might be having this in reverse. We are going to have an Islamist movement that is going to be authoritarian. They're going to offer a diverse visage, basically, just for the world to see, but rule is going to be in the hands of small clique who are all Islamists, basically. So this is the fear, and this is still a possibility that we need to take it seriously. There are a lot of reasons for us to be concerned that the way that the challenges, societal and political, now are being tackled in the way that everything is being pushed to later. And now we want to focus on this issue and that issue, providing services, civilization, important issues in themselves. But you cannot ignore the fact that there are a lot of political and societal challenges that you need to talk about and to face, and you cannot postpone that to a year or 2 years from now while you're working quietly behind closed room to sort of introduce your own vision in a complete way and impose it on us. We need to be part of that dialogue. We need to have that dialogue take place in a transparent manner. We need to be partners in it. The idea of those who liberated have a right to decide everything, which is a statement that a lot of Syrians who are pro-HTS are saying, man yuharrir yuqarrir, he who liberates determines. That is not acceptable. This is not the way things work in that when you want to represent a country in a fair and democratic manner. So there are concerns, there are challenges, and I think the immediate thing that HTS need to tackle, and this is something that the foreign minister of the caretaker government, when he participated in Davos and had his little interview with Tony Blair, he had an opportunity to do it and he didn't. He should have sent clear message on how the Kurds, religious community, the secular currents will be accommodated in Syria, so that when we sit down to talk about the constitution, we are not trying to negotiate our rights away. We are, in fact, we know that our rights are guaranteed because we have this sort of a clear statement from HTS on this. And now we're discussing how the country is going to be governed, how these rights are going to be protected. But the rights themselves should be inviolable. And this is something that's apparently not yet been clearly considered by the current government. And therefore, we should keep pushing in this direction. This is a challenge that they are not yet addressing in a serious manner. If you want to talk about failures, this is still an area where they are failing, but they are not realizing it, I think. They are still boiled over by the receptivity of the international community and many Syrians to actually sit down with them and accept them as the legitimate leaders of the transitional process. But that should not be seen as the end of it. This is it. We can do whatever we want right now. We can sort of postpone other issues till later. Receptivity is not final, and people can turn on a dime and hate you if you are not willing to commit officially in a clear manner to a vision that meets their expectations.
I'm so glad you mentioned the eclectic nature of the arts in Syria. And if I recall correctly, for our listeners, your mother is apparently quite a famous movie star in Syria.
As she is, her name is Muna Wassef, and people can Google her. She has a Wikipedia page. it's She is amazing. She's now 82 years old, and last year she received a major sort of lifetime achievement award from the Saudi Joe Awards, which takes place this time every year. And this year she was also nominated for Best Actress. So she's still acting, she's still active, she's still nominated for awards. She's known all over the Arab world, and I lived with her as a major figure in the arts world, in the Syrian artistic community for all my life. She is I think she's the only person I know whose career just was steady climb, no setback, whatever, year after year after year. Her fame grows, and I'm really inspired by that. I can never match it, but I'm inspired by it nonetheless. It's something about the reason I know so much about the concerns of the artistic community is, of course, my mom. And what many people don't know is that she had political positions of her own in the early 70s, and she was shut down immediately when she tried to protest against the clampdown on freedom of speech in the country. She wasn't that brave, by her own admission, so she quieted down. And then at the beginning of the revolution, she also said something like, "I would, if it will help people stop shooting at each other, I'll go and be with the protesters in the streets and let the army stop shooting." And she also signed what's known as the Milk Declaration, which is when the regime besieged the communities in Daraa in South Syria and starved people basically. So there was a lot of in the artistic community signed a statement calling on the regime to allow humanitarian aid to enter the country, and she was invited to attend the first internal opposition meeting that the vice president at the time conducted with the internal opposition. So she was active for a while, but then she and I had a conversation, and I told her, if you're not planning on leaving the country, perhaps you should, be quieter, because if you want to keep talking, they are not going to tolerate that. Your reputation doesn't matter anymore. It can only go so far in terms of protecting you. They can put you under house arrest. I mean, or you stop you from working, which is you're not going to like. So she decided after a while that, okay, I want to stay in the country. I'm not prepared to leave. And so she quieted down after that. But now she's sort of happy. She haven't made any public statements majorly, except to say that I'm optimistic about the situation. She doesn't want to be seen as having waited until the regime falls, has spoken out publicly or whatever. So she decided, I'd better just watch and learn and see how things are going.
Well, from that, Ammar, do you have a sense that there is increasing space in a serious way for civil society? Your mom was an artist, and that gave her a vehicle into engaging in a quasi-civil society, or, well, quite frankly, a civil society role. You've been very active externally in a civil society role. What is your sense of the space? Because it's new. When you and I, when we did work on Libya, the notion of civil society was new. Same with Yemen. What is your sense of the space for civil society actors at the moment in Syria? Or do you have to pick a side? Do you have to pick a party? Do you have to pick a team?
Actually, right now it's an amazing, it's a laboratory. You can do anything. No one is stopping you. So people have freedom simply by virtue of the fact that there is yet no mechanisms. And I think HTS are being very careful about establishing mechanisms for how civil society should operate. They cannot just say foreign funded, foreign funding is prohibited, because they need foreign funding. And so they cannot use the old line of the regimes, basically, which is, we don't want foreign funding for civil society. What sort of civil society is that? So they cannot use that kind of argument, because they know that civil society need to be funded, and the regime need to be funded from outside as well, if they want to carry out the reconstruction and provide basic services again at an acceptable level in the country. So they cannot establish that, and they cannot sort of prohibit certain aspects of speech, because that will also backfire on them. So the only thing they said is that hate speech and sectarian speech is prohibited, which is understandable in these circumstances. We can still hear it, but at least there is an injunction or guidelines prohibiting it from the authorities. Beyond that, there is nothing so far to organize civil society. So that is given people a lot of leeway to do what they want. And this is something we haven't seen in Syria since independence days from the French in the 1940s. So that is a very rare thing. I mean, is it going to continue? I don't know. When I began opposing the regime in the late 1990s, and sort of we couldn't even register a civil society, I had to have a license for a publishing house. And under that license, we sort of had an online forums. And I said, oh, that's a form of publishing. And we had meetings and intellectual salon. Or we're basically discussing the new books that we are going to publish. So we always found a way around the prohibitions. But at the end of the day, we were breaking the law when everyone knew it, and we were living on the willingness of the regime to put up and tolerate certain aspects of our activities for their own calculations. But at the end of the day, when I pushed the envelope too much and I called for civil disobedience and called President Assad at that time an international press an idiot who's driving us towards catastrophe, I ended up being exiled, and we had a chance to meet. But right now, the conditions are to die for in the sense because it's virgin territory, and there are nothing restricting you from embarking on an activity. But it still be advisable, of course, to abide by the usual guidelines that you would expect, at least in a democratic country, for how civil society should operate. And if you want to establish an organization, you need to have still the clear vision and avoid the pitfalls and of sectarian rhetoric, and try as much as possible to be aware of the geopolitical context in which you are operating and working.
Well, Ammar, let's move from that end of the spectrum, civil society, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is America's strategic interest. This has been a really interesting week in Washington, D.C. and in the United States. There has been a directive that U.S. foreign policy should be focused on America's strategic interest, which by and large makes sense. You and I know why a democratic transition in Syria is core to America's strategic interest, and lots of other countries as well. But take a few minutes and make the case why this democratic transition in Syria is so central to America's strategic interests.
Well, it's interesting to see it. There are a variety of levels to it. The level that no one is noticing is that if HTS is indeed moderating itself in a serious manner, and if through a combination of diplomacy by the US and Europe and our regional allies, we can work to make sure that this transition accommodates basic rights for Syria's communal diversity, religious diversity, women, and the secular currents. If something came out that's more participatory, where the role of the Islamic current is to be a conservative party like AKP in Turkey, it may not be the best example from the standpoint of classical liberals, but still it's something that's functioning within the overall framework of a secular state. So if something along this line emerges and the Islamist movement in Syria, the current HTS and allies transform themselves into a conservative party rather than into sort of a strictly religious party that want to impose its own vision on the state and its institutions entirely. So if that's achievable, this is going to be an example now that can be replicated elsewhere in the Middle East, and it can inspire other Islamist movements to probably follow these lines. And it would be a way for us to contain the Islamic challenge by showing that the international community is willing to accommodate Islamist participation in politics under certain guidelines, and that in fact they'll work with them as partners if this is achieved. So we have an example here to change the paradigm in terms of our relation with the Islamic movements in general, and which are always, whenever you are going to deal with change in the Middle East, any form of change, the issue of Islamism is going to come out. So if we can, in Syria, provide a new model that's promising, that's workable, that is something that would be, I think, shaking in a sense. It could change things for decades to come, and not only inside Syria. So that's one aspect that I think is important, and why the US should be involved and should be patient and be willing to sort of keep an interaction happening. I think we can influence behavior not through a sort of warning from outside or conditionality from outside, but through engagement. We can have this kind of conditionality be transformed into a reality that influences life in Syria. So that's one aspect. The other thing is that Iran and Russia are now out of Syria. Iran is, I think, is being completely rejected by Syrian society and will not be accepted, perhaps so long as there is an Islamic Republic, or until the Islamic Republic really changes its tune and become more accommodating of the interests of its regional neighbors and more willing to apologize, basically, for its involvement in Syria on the side of Assad. So that is something that's important because Iran now is in a weaker position So if you want to negotiate with it, which is what I think the Trump administration prefers, negotiations, now you have it in a weak position. And this is the time to take advantage of that. And it's namely because they lost not simply Lebanon, but Syria as well was a major foothold for them, and now they're out. Russia is weak. Just a couple of days ago, the authorities have terminated the contract of a Russian company to run the port in Tartus, which is a major port that the Russians relied on in their activities in the Mediterranean region and the African Sahel. So now you have that taken out of consideration for a while. Russia still maintains a military presence. There is still a base in Khmeimim. There are still Russian soldiers there. They are not active. They are slowly withdrawing. But HTS is still sort of talking to the Russians. And if you want Russia to be weakened or completely out of Syria, then you need to be able to sit down with the HTS leaders and work out a deal with them that will also protect them from any kind of Russian backlash and will consolidate their hold over these bases. So, in a sense, you're seeing your allies, your enemies in the region, your geopolitical rivals on the regional and global level weakened. You don't want China to win. You want to be the one filling that gap. And you want your regional allies basically to help in this regard. The Captagon trade, which was a trouble for the entire region, was beginning to actually land in Europe and affect European drug markets, basically, and now is out. The Captagon trade, Syria was the capital of it. It's completely destroyed. And every day they discover new laboratories and new storage facilities, and they destroy the stockpiles. So that is also gone, and you want to make sure the know-how is still there, though, and the ability is still there, and it can be rebuilt in relatively short period of time. You don't want that to re-emerge. You don't want the economic circumstances to drive the authorities to try to explore again with the possibility of doing something along these lines to compensate for the lack of foreign aid, for instance. So there are a lot of reasons for the engagement. There is the issue of refugees and their return and settlement inside Syria. There is the possibility of security cooperation because you have a movement that has a lot of ties with, or used to have a lot of ties with jihadists, and they might share information. I think they did in the case of ISIS, for instance. So you have a common interest. ISIS is still there, it's trying to reemerge, and you have partners in the HTS and rebels and their affiliates that they are willing to actually they see in it as a common enemy. So you can work now with HTS and not only with the Kurds. You can use that perhaps as a way to, foster dialogue between HTS and the Kurds, basically in the next few weeks. In other words, terrorism is something that would also be a common interest, and you want to fight together. So a variety of overlapping issues that are important to the U.S. and its regional interests exist and can benefit a lot from this transition that's taken place. The fall of Assad was definitely a good news for the American administration, whether it's Trump or Biden. It was something that was hailed by both sides, and I think they were right to do so. And now, however, they need to adopt the right policy and continue engagement. Conditionality with engagement, no problem, but engagement. Don't don't create a distance, and don't be too slow in diplomatically sending people to talk and explore possibilities of work with the current caretaker governments. It's something that requires immediate handling.
You and I have learned over the last 20 years, engaging on various Arab Spring situations, that window of opportunity is a window of opportunity, and it closes after a period of time. So early and effective conditional engagement is crucial. Let me ask you a spoilers question. Who's sitting in the dark corner of the room plotting to undermine this democratic transition in Syria? And I remember when I was working with Jamal Ben-Ammar, the UN envoy for Yemen, we had a conversation. He said, "Yeah, look at there, and there. There are spoilers plotting to undermine this democratic transition in Yemen." Who are some of the spoilers in Syria, and what are you worried about?
Well, I'm worried about if the stabilization in the coastal areas didn't happen as fast as it should, and in the south areas of Syria, and the situation with the Kurds, we still have issues here. And if that doesn't proceed apace, I mean, I'm giving it a year, but it has to be, and the Kurdish situation hopefully should be resolved in the next couple of months if you really want to avoid violence. But the coastal areas might require up to a year because they're still old regime loyalists. They are not fighting for principle, but they're fighting for survival. They are the intermediary level officers who know that they have committed a lot of crimes and that if they were they didn't have a chance to leave the country and now they're locked inside and they have to fight for their survival. So they are gathering some disgruntled elements around themselves, some criminal elements, and trying to basically pretend they are the freedom fighters now representing the Alawites or the Christian community. So there is that element. And if it is, you have to play whack-a-mole basically with these movements for a while, but you don't want them to get communal support. Up until now, they are not getting communal support. Everybody in the Alawite community know these people are criminals and they're in it for themselves. They are trying to echo a sentiment and words that make sense from a sectarian perspective, using some of the mistaken sectarian rhetorics used by some HTS fighters in their videos. They're digging out old videos, pretending, that they are new and spreading disinformation. But so far, without success. However, if the situation drags out and if some needs of the local Alawite communities are not listened to, if you keep firing employees who are mostly Alawites, for instance, like in one hospital in Tartus, there was a hospital that can only accommodate 164 patients, and yet the number of employees were 7,000. Because the regime was stopping people. So right now, there were many of them, of course, were, let go, but many of them are Alawites and they want to live. And they were given some compensation for 3 months, which is not enough by the current standards. And there was no attempt at trying to say, okay, if you did that in other hospitals and other institutions, this is going to really have a negative impact. You're going to have a lot of disgruntled people out there who have no way to work and they therefore might join a local rebellion, or at least young men might join the local rebellion. So you need to think very carefully about the impact of these kind of decisions on the long haul. The longer this drags out, you know, the worse will be the prospect for stability in Syria. There is a possibility that the UAE might do a Sudan-like move in Syria. At least some people are saying that because they're not at all happy with HTS as an Islamist movement. And I can understand the reasons. The UAE's founder was very anti-political Islam. And his legacy to his children was never trust the Islamists. And his successors are carrying out this legacy and they are fighting against the Muslim Brotherhood and any type of Islamism across the region. And that's why they took such a hard line in Sudan, for instance. And now they seem to be seeing the same thing in Syria, which is why they were never really supportive of the opposition. And now they are worried about the HTS leadership, but they are mellowing down of recently as well. I mean, their stance initially was very rejectionist. Now they seem to be engaging. I think the leader of UAE had a phone conversation with the foreign minister. So there is some contact and a humanitarian aid was sent also to Syria. And the possibility of them doing something in the south because there was one particular rebel group made a few hundred men that hasn't yet completely pledged allegiance to HS. Uh, some people thought that this could be whipped up into something. I don't see it personally. I think that the UAE is going to soften its line on HTS in Syria in due course. But the US can also facilitate that if they want to and speed it up. You don't want to recreate trouble in Syria. In other words, it's better to deal with this situation with its complexity over the next few years rather than plunge the country into another round of violence. But that's a slim possibility that some people are talking about. I'm not convinced that it's going to happen. So Iran might have some sleeper cells, but I don't think they are going to be as dangerous as people think. So far, the few attempts at doing something was immediately stifled by HTS. And ISIS tried to conduct some terrorist attacks that were immediately thwarted before anything serious has developed. So these are the spoilers, basically. Iran sleeper cells, possible UAE move in the south, which I dismiss. ISIS sleeper cells are still a possibility. And I would imagine that even a year or 2 years from now, when everything might look really beautiful, ISIS will spoil the day by conducting some terror attack here or there, because that's the kind of group they are. We cannot immediately eliminate that possibility, unfortunately. So the good news is the spoilers, they seem to have a weaker hand, a weaker possibilities of doing damage, because the Assad regime was so brittle, and Russia is out and Iran is out, and the regime fell apart so quickly. And ISIS was already weakened by many years of US attacks. So all the possible spoilers have been weakened. So we have time, therefore, to do something and to make sure that the worst scenarios do not transpire.
I would only add to your list sort of frenemies, and this is one of the things we've seen is
Yeah.
we talk about a democratic transition. There are a number of states in the region who aren't democratic, and if Syria can transition to a functioning democracy, or if Iraq can transition, why can't the UAE, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, other places? Why can't they transition? So they want success and they want stability, but they're a little afraid of
They,
monster under the
they,
bed.
they worry about democracy. Yeah, you know what? If I were in the Gulf, I wouldn't be worried about democracy in Syria for the simple reason that the conditions of the two societies are very different. And some of the democratic forces that exist in these societies tend to be heavy on Islamism, which a lot of people are trying to basically put away for a while. I mean, they were tired of that rhetoric. So I'm not sure to which extent there will be a serious threat for Syrian democracy to Saudi or UAE at this stage. But I think Egypt should be concerned, yes. But not. But one thing happened recently, which is that an Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood type who is in Syria and was with HTS, part of the foreign fighters, made a video in which he said, we are coming in CC or next and something along these lines, and he was immediately jailed. Because one of the promises that HTS made to the neighbors and to the international community, we are not going to export the revolution. We are not going to destabilize our countries. So in that direct manner, Egypt or any country in the region, I don't think they will be under threat, because HTS have a vested interest in not causing trouble to its neighbors. But simply by succeeding, they could inspire people's desire for change in an Egypt, for instance, or in Algeria or Tunisia again. So these countries might be afraid, therefore, despite all of these assurances about not wanting to export the revolution, because the successful example in Syria can be troublesome for them. So for these regimes, I would be worried. But at the same time, their ability to hurt in a direct manner, the situation in Syria is very limited. But they simply can make life difficult for the Syrian refugees living in their midst.
That makes perfect sense in terms of
Yeah.
what the trajectory might be with Syria's democratic transition. What lessons are you sharing with your colleagues in Syria from your work and your engagement and your observations of the other Arab Spring transitions, those that have been successful and those that have failed? What are some of the key, or are there key takeaways from Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Sudan?
The takeaways, I think, is don't give up in a sense, and focus on whatever area you're in, focus on governance. Because the reason that HTS was able to finally build up its capacity to the point where they can lead this kind of transition, lead a successful and quick uprising, and lead this kind of transition was governance. They focused on governance. They've learned from, remember when in 13 we've conducted a wave of training of activists, and you were one of so many people doing it. Many people who attended these kind of meetings ended up working with HTS. So they've learned from other experiences, they've studied, they've built up capacity, they focus on education, they analyze transitional movement elsewhere and try to draw lessons from it. So that kind of openness, this kind of willingness to learn from other experiences and to govern the countries that are, or the parts of the countries that are under your control effectively, and not simply be imposing taxes and living like so often the militias basically they sap the energies of the communities they control by overtaxation and or burdening the economy and being like a parasitic entity. But in this case, and even though many of the HTS leaders were not from Idlib itself, but they worked with the local community, they understood the need to make themselves legitimate in the eyes of the local community. They accommodated local realities to the best of their ability, and they focused on governance. So in the first few years, they were hated, but then in the last few years, they were widely accepted and they tolerated, even when there were protests against their rule and again in Idlib. They didn't use violence. They didn't try to replicate the tactics of the regime. They allowed for this kind of things to happen, and they tried to listen to their critics. So that kind of strategy is important. If you focus on governance, you focus on making yourself really popular locally and learn continuously from your experience and be open to the experiences in other countries and try as much as possible to learn from them. That will give you the necessary experience, the necessary structure and framework to be able to transition that then into a larger framework where you can take over the country and transition. But if you try to wait until you are actually in power in the center and then learn, then it's your success will be militarily and you'll easily squander it politically. We are not seeing that in these circumstances. That Shares is winning politically, much more so than militarily. Their entire move was based on basically quick military successes, but politically they were ready. They've shown that they were ready to lead.
Ammar, you've been very generous with your time. So just one more question, which is, what is a key takeaway that you want our listeners to know? Is there a question that you were hoping I would ask that I didn't ask, or is there a personal perspective that you want to share?
The one thing that I feel that needs to be understood, especially by an international audience who watch the situation in Syria and elsewhere, is to realize that local populations have agency. Do not analyze the situation completely from what's my government doing and why it is not doing, and sort of lead by this conspiratorial thinking, because it deprives us, completely from agency. It's as if we have no reason to hate Assad except that some of the people on the left right now saying, "Oh, he is a resistance to Israel." And that's why this whole thing is, to overthrow him is to basically curtail resistance to Israel and so on and so forth. It's as if we had no reason to hate Assad. And Assad was such a good guy, and he's secular, but he's not. He's sectarian. So we need to have nuance. We need to sort of adhere to local voices, what they are saying. It's not that the local voices are going to be unbiased, but at least you need to realize that there is room for nuance. And in the battle with secularism and Islamism in Syria, everybody has blood on their hands. Those who ruled in the name of Islam were sectarian and they were oppressive. And now we have Islamists coming, and we know Islamists come in different types. So you have the ISIS, you have Qaeda, and then you have these people who went through these phases, and now they're proven to be more pragmatic and more understanding of local realities and even international politics than we've had under the Assad regime. So it's not Islamism bad, secularism good. Sometimes you have to look deeper than that. You have to look beyond the labels. You have to look at what actual actions on the ground are unfolding, and you have to be wary. If some of the people who look nice are behaving like Assad did, then who cares about how they look and what they say? And if some of the people who might look to you, why do they have these beards and this funny way of looking and whatever? But they end up doing the right things and the right words and freeing prisoners, accommodating religious minorities to the best of that possibly can be done in this period. Then you really have to realize perhaps I can work with them. So we need to look at the actions, we need to look beyond the labels, and we need to appreciate nuance, and we need to realize that there is agency to the people demanding change. They are not part of a marionette show with the strings being moved from outside. Conspiratorial thinking has really undermined the kind of support we could have gotten early on in this. I still remember in 2013 when the anti-war movement in the UK sort of went and managed to prevail, and they celebrated the decision by the parliament not to participate in an action against Assad after he used chemical weapons in Syria. And that decision influenced Obama's attitude as well. And at the end of the day, we ended up with Obama walking away from the red line and for the massacres in Syria to continue, even using chemical weapons years later, up until just the last few weeks. So we could have been spared a lot of pain had something was done in 2013 rather than in 2024.
Well, Ammar, I'm so glad you mentioned agency because you'll recall that the very first time we met, you spoke about that, okay, there's all kinds of strategic interest and there's this, that, and all these transitions going on, et cetera. But you have to understand what the people of Syria are experiencing, what they're being threatened by, and what their views are, and what their hopes and dreams are. And it's taken a while, but it's amazing that the hopes and dreams, to a degree, have come true, and that we're hopefully on the verge of seeing a democratic transition in Syria, and which you've been engaged in and been fighting for decades. So it's been a real privilege to know you as a friend for all of these years, and it's been a real honor to have you on the program to share your thoughts and your ideas with our listeners. So thank you very much. I'm very, very grateful.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the future engagement in Damascus.
Looking forward to it. Tea in Damascus.
See you in Damascus.